Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative, and United University Professions, representing 37,000 academic and professional employees at SUNY campuses and teaching hospitals across New York State. Frederick E. Cole, President, uupinfo.org. It's the Capital Connection. Hi, I'm David Gustina. Back with us is the New York State Comptroller, Tom DiNapoli. He's a Democrat. Welcome back, Tom.
David, great to be back with you.
Well, the big news, and I know you have weighed in on this, came at the end of session, and this has to do with the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the MTA, and the congestion pricing plan that the governor, that's Governor Kathy Hochul, suspended at the very last minute. That had reaction on both sides. The governor, said it would cause financial hardship on low-income residents, especially those traveling to the city from Long Island, New Jersey, and Connecticut. It, of course, would charge drivers entering Manhattan below 60th Street, seen as a tax by many. And at the same time, the legislature chose not to bail out the transportation agency, refusing to approve proposals to increase the payroll mobility tax or siphon money from the state's general fund. So it leaves the agency kind of in a hole. I'm seeing numbers like $15 billion. And I know you're not happy because you want to keep the system in good repair.
Well, I think of my dear friend, our former Lieutenant Governor Dick Ravitch, who led the MTA, and he always, whenever we talked about funding for public transit in New York, always said, you have to keep the system in good repair. You can't let it deteriorate and go back to the bad old days of decades ago, and you need reliable funding sources. So, I've often been asked prior to, the scenario you just described, how do I feel about congestion pricing? And I always said, look, it is a policy choice that the state of New York has made, right? There's actually a law that enabled it. So I have neither a pro or a con, a personal opinion. It doesn't matter what a personal opinion may be. The MTA's funding, particularly its capital plan that keeps the system in a state of good repair, allows for expansion, enhanced safety, and so on. The funding for that capital plan is contingent upon this money, the $15 billion that you alluded to. So if you don't want to have congestion pricing, and people can have that opinion, what are you going to come up with as the substitute revenue source? And that's my concern with where we're at right now. Whether the governor was right or wrong to put a pause on that, that was her choice to do it. But again, because of the timing and how quickly it happened, obviously the legislature was in no position to deal with filling that hole. So the MTA board, as you know, has met, and they've indicated that they have to, essentially reprioritize their capital spending. And the report we put out before that MTA board meeting really tried to point out very clearly that there aren't any good options for the MTA if the money is not there. They're going to have to put a priority on, basic maintenance and try to keep the system in good repair. But some of the improvements on, for example, accessibility to make the system more ADA compliant for people with disabilities, many of those initiatives are going to have to be put on hold for now. Signal modernization, what really has an impact on safety and the quality of the timing of the trains, put on hold. Second Avenue subway expansion, something that goes back to the 1970s in terms of planning, on hold. And other kinds of initiatives that have been in the plan, they're just going to be on an indefinite hold. So the governor has said, as you know, that her commitment is to keep the MTA well-funded and not to have these projects be totally eliminated. But, the big question still is, where's the money going to come from? How much of it will be there? So in the short run, a lot of very important initiatives are on hold, and the capital plan is going to be significantly reduced. You don't want to go back, again, echoing Dick Ravitch, you don't want to go back to a system in poor repair because we're not back to 100% of ridership because of the pandemic. And the MTA is so dependent on fares and ridership. So if the system starts falling backward on state of its condition and its state of good repair, we could see those numbers going in the wrong direction. So a lot of concern. We'll see where it goes, but we've really got to come up with the money to plug this very significant hole in the capital plan funding.
State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli, two questions. One, if it doesn't come from these plans I mentioned to fill the hole, you mentioned it doesn't matter what my personal opinion is, but where do you see that money as the chief financial officer for the state? Where should that money come from? Should it come from a tax? Should it come from a congestion pricing plan? Should it come out of the general fund?
Well, I think it's been pretty clear that there needs to be another revenue source to back up the capital plan. And as you know, even in this year's budget, that there was some increase, as far as support for the MTA on some of the existing revenue streams. So, the mobility tax is an example. Could you put even more on that? I think that was, one of the proposals. Some have suggested allocating more money from the sales tax. So, I think the likelihood of just finding money with existing revenue streams probably is not the answer. It's very easy. People say, "Oh, the MTA spends so much money," and we've certainly had audits that have said they could be smarter and more efficient on a whole host of areas. But when it comes to the capital plan, you really need a reliable long-term funding stream. And keep in mind the strategy behind the congestion pricing was that for the money that was going to come in, they would then be able to bond over a longer term. That's how you got that $15 billion figure. But it would be backed up by a very clear revenue source, meaning the money that would come from this tolling. So, one of the other ideas, obviously, that people are throwing out there is to still have a congestion pricing, but not at the generally the $15 level that had been floated. Do it at a lower amount and then come up with some other revenue to back it up. So, hey, look, one of the advantages of being controller is others have to make that decision. So I don't want to presume which will be the best choice of the options, but we're going to continue to say to do nothing is not really acceptable. You really are going to so hurt the system by having the capital plan be thrown so out of balance by this lack of revenue. Either go back to the drawing boards and refigure how you're going to do congestion pricing, or if you're going to abandon it, you must come up with a reliable funding stream to replace that money. Too many important projects are now being put on hold. And the way things are with inflation, and you do all this planning and then you got to restart it again, you're only going to drive up the costs as well. So I think there are many good reasons why this really needs to be dealt with sooner than later.
Yeah, and my second question is just that. It's hard for me to make sense when the governor now says she remains committed to working with the MTA, as you cited, to try to find the funding, but the plan was there. Now it's gone, and it seems self-created in the sense that even if you argue politically, which I know those arguments are out there from the analysis I've read, that this would be bad for Democrats because they could argue as another tax and might affect the congressional elections. I just don't see it, and I don't see why politically necessarily it's bad when you improve infrastructure, which you point out needs to be kept up to date. And we also have this whole thing with climate change requiring it.
Yeah, and look, for everybody in New York State, the New York City metropolitan region obviously has been, will continue to be the economic engine for the state, and for the New York City metro area to continue to thrive economically, you need an up-to-date modern transit system, and it's fair to say that it's an old system. It's had a lot of struggles. They finally, one of the consequences of COVID, you saw all this federal money come in. The system was able to survive through COVID. For essential workers, it was the opportunity to still get into work, during COVID, and particularly for people in the outer boroughs. The buses and the subway is so important for folks like my neighbors on Long Island, Long Island Railroad and Metro North for people in the lower Hudson Valley. I mean, this really is the lifeblood for the city's economy, which benefits the entire state. So to not protect this investment is a huge mistake that will hurt everyone. And I think you saw David Rhea of Albany just had a report out also that talked about many of the businesses upstate New York that have contracts that are tied to some of these infrastructure investments, and the cancellation of plans will hurt them. So you just see the multiplier effect. And you look again. people with a higher pay grade than me, make these decisions. But you can't run away from this, and it needs to be. It's got to be more than a promise. It can't just be an IOU. And you've got the legislature out of session. You got elections coming up. I don't think anybody's talking about the legislature coming back until after the legislative session. So to the extent that any new revenue source would require legislative action, we're probably talking several months away from this being resolved. And it's very clear from what was said, the MTA board, by and large, is still supportive of this, but they recognize that, without the governor's blessing, it can't go forward. So there's still a lot to be figured out, and as I said, others will make the decision as to how to deal with it. We're just going to keep reminding everybody the hole is real, the impact on the capital plan is real, and we've got to figure out how to plug that hole sooner than later.
We are speaking with New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli, a Democrat, on the Capital Connection. I'm David Gustina. Tom, the reports that you put out are interesting. I would hope that you would head to the New York State Comptroller's website and check those out. Just Google New York State Comptroller. That will pop right up. And you can read these reports. One I was pleasantly surprised to see, Tom, is that New York City tourism has approached full recovery now. The pandemic really hurt, obviously, tourism. But we are seeing things coming back. That economic infusion is huge. And I'll even relate it to radio and public radio, where a lot of those tourism advertisements or underwriting announcements infuse radio with money in the summertime when venues, places like Tanglewood and the Saratoga Performing Arts Center or Lincoln Center down in New York or other places, want to advertise their performances.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's definitely a multiplier effect here as well, which is why, especially this time of year, doing appropriate advertising on behalf of all the different venues and opportunities for entertainment in New York is a very sound investment. Look, the pandemic obviously was devastating at many levels, but particularly for tourism and extend that out. Sorry, it's entertainment, it's recreation, it's the restaurants, all of that whole ecosystem in New York City had an incredibly sharp decline and loss of revenue, loss of tax revenue, loss of jobs. So we're virtually back at 100%. But much of that is driven more by, at least New York City, domestic tourism. We still haven't seen a full recovery as far as international tourism. And many of the folks that travel from overseas tend to spend more money when they get here, particularly historically the Chinese tourists have been the ones that have spent the most. But the mix is a little different now. In our latest analysis, we're seeing more coming from the UK, had kind of supplanted China in terms of providing the greatest level of foreign tourists. So we're hoping that as time goes on, we'll see an uptick in the number of foreign tourists coming. And certainly for the city, this kind of recovery is very good news. But isn't that tied to our earlier discussion as well about the ability to get around the city? So the importance of the transit system as well, the importance of dealing with quality of life issues in the city, particularly crime, safety, homelessness, mental health. Those issues impact on the desire of people to want to come into New York City to enjoy the museums and the Broadway shows and all of that. But, I think especially this time of year, you and I were talking offline before we started the formal conversation, there are so many great places to go in New York. This is the time of year to really enjoy, whether it's
and you're going to be traveling to most of them.
Well, many of them.
Yeah.
Maybe not so much a vacation, but for other reasons. But I love Lake Placid as one example. Not to pick a favorite, but that's always been a favorite of mine. You go up the Thousand Island region, absolutely beautiful. Very, and I always say to many of my downstate friends, you don't fully appreciate upstate New York, the Adirondacks, the Finger Lakes, the St. Lawrence Seaway,
Eagle Bay.
I mean, unbelievable. I mean, the variety of course, the Hudson Valley has so many great historic opportunities, the wineries in New York State. But let's not forget Long Island, too. Right, David?
Sure.
I mean, Nassau, Suffolk County, the best beaches in the world right there. and certainly Suffolk.
All right. Send your
wineries,
cards and letters to the state controller, Tom DiNapoli, wherever you are in the state, if you like your beaches better.
And hey, I'll go for the southern tier in Chautauqua and Western New York as well.
Very nice.
Some great venues there also. Yeah,
you will get to the state fair though this year, right?
Oh yeah. Well, look, the state fair is just, and they've really done so much to enhance the infrastructure there. The physical layout of the fair. But again, that's another New York gem, and for too many folks, a lot of the folks in Central New York know it well and spend time there because it's based in Syracuse and Tanaghettus, that area. But all New Yorkers should take the time to go to the Great New York State Fair. It's not just the wonderful. I get a kick out of the agricultural exhibits, to see the different animals, and I get a kick out of that. Some people may not be into that. I think it's. I'm not a farm guy, but I admire people who that's how they have their career and their livelihood. But all the other opportunities to showcase New York products, the Indian Village, incredible legacy of Native Americans in that area, and the Indian Village is just a wonderful exhibit as well. There's just so much to see and do, and it's fun. I mean, maybe a little too much fried things, but, that's okay. You can cheat a little bit at the state fair. And look, David, across the state, all the different county fairs as well. I mean, this is a time of year, so many of our counties do these wonderful fairs, of a more regional nature, but also great opportunities. But I always say to folks, and frankly, I'll be honest, I did not go to the New York State Fair until I became state controller, and I didn't realize what I was missing all those years. So, yeah, New York State Fair, end of August, that's definitely a place New Yorkers and others should go and attend and enjoy.
Right. And many of these, of course, in the nicer months are outside where we get to enjoy the beautiful season here upstate and downstate. But the issue that we haven't drifted far from as we begin to talk about issues as the leg bone is connected to the foot bone is, you get my drift, but the environment. And at the end of the legislative session, we had, I'll give you the good news first and get your reaction, and then we'll talk about some of the bad news. But the Climate Superfund Act passed. Now, that requires polluters to pay. That's going to bring money from polluters. Your reaction to that?
I think it was a good move that it did pass. I know Senator Liz Krueger had been championing this for a long time. She was the lead sponsor in the Senate. And I think some folks weren't expecting it to move. And I think part of what happened, as you're well aware, some of the other environmental bills that had gotten a lot of interest,
right,
expanding the bottle bill expansion, the plastic reduction, I forgot the formal title of
Repackaging and Reduction Act.
Exactly.
And the Heat Act.
And the Heat Act. They had gotten more of the public attention, if I could put it that way.
Sure.
So this other bill, I think, kind of became, fairly or not, a substitute for the things that were moving. But I think it was good. I think it's an important concept. Certainly in terms of funding, it's key. You're right. We have very ambitious climate goals that we are, at this point, as we've put reports out, we have a lot more work to do if we're going to meet those goals. However, I don't think it's happened yet, but from the rumblings that I've read about in the media is that likely to face court challenge, from the industry that could put that on hold or delay implementation. But yeah,
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but you're the financial guy, and I wonder why we can't make this financial argument.
Yeah.
That this is where you can bring the two parties together, where you can say, listen, this is an opportunity, not a detriment to our finance. This is a chance for us to figure out how to create the facilities through utilities and everywhere else to not rely on fossil fuels anymore, to open up jobs for people who can work on climate and climate solutions, including, jobs that include hard hats and people on the ground and construction. And again, things where you're building and developing and there's progress and there's financial growth, you would think both parties could agree on. And that seems to be the opportunity with climate change.
It should be. And you laid out the case and the argument very well, and I agree with you. The other piece to look at, though, is that there's always a cost, right? So this bill really attempts to say, instead of the cost being borne by consumers, right, that those that are benefiting financially from these kinds of industries should be the ones up front to help pay for the consequences of of the products and the services that they provide. So I think what I like about the approach is it kind of puts the cost at the front end where it should be, with a goal then to reduce the kind of activity and output that creates the cost burden to begin with. So, look, I'm sure in terms of the traditional model for some of these, businesses, they feel it's too costly to them. But we don't measure effectively enough the societal cost. We all end up paying for it. We all end up paying the consequence, whether it's consumers or taxpayers. And this bill, I think, really provides a more intelligent way to place the responsibility for where those costs should be. Again, then with the incentive to be sure that we're changing our behavior along the lines that you very eloquently laid out, to have the benefits from the kind of transition that we need to have economically, which obviously will do much to protect our environment, our planet, our health in the long run. So, yeah, I mean, so this was a good thing that bill passed. And I'm sure when the legislature reconvenes, they'll get back to looking at some of those other issues. You've got Deborah Glick leading the effort in the Assembly, the committee I used to chair, the Environmental Conservation Committee, and Senator Harcum, I believe, is still the chair of the Environment Committee in the Senate. Those are two smart, very effective legislators, very strong advocates, and I think the environment, my experience always was, that's one of those few issues these days where you can actually, among the general public, get people to agree whether they're Republicans or Democrats. The environment was always an opportunity to build consensus that I felt wasn't there with many other issues.
Well, here's a tough one. New York children in need. The urgency of lifting children out of poverty. This is from your office, Comptroller DiNapoli, May 2024. Nearly 1 in 5 New York children. 1 in 5. Listen to that. 1 in 5 New York children live in poverty, and rates are significantly higher in some of New York's largest cities. With the 2021 Child Poverty Reduction Act, New York has set a goal to reduce child poverty by 50% by 2031. How's it going? I mean, how can we live in a state, in a country? I just can't get over it, where children suffer the most.
And we have the reputation of being among the wealthiest states, rightfully so, in the country, and yet we have this poverty rate among children. So a couple of points. First of all, when you look at the cities in the United States with the top percentage of children in poverty, out of the top 10, 3 of the 10, David, are right here in New York, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse. That also is another item not for us to be proud of. And you saw during COVID, with all the federal money that came in, a lot of the family support and social assistance that came in, nutrition support and so on, you saw the gap get reduced. You saw those numbers improve. What's happened since many of those federal programs have now phased out or being spent down, we're starting to see the gap grow again, and New York now diverging from the national trend in a negative way. So this report on child poverty followed our reports on nutrition and housing and poverty in general for families to really keep a spotlight on what's happening. As I think you said, New York is in need. That's kind of like the overall theme for these series of reports we've put out. We don't want to see New York being, a tale of two cities, where you have some of the wealthiest people in the country here and growing numbers of poverty rates, particularly among children, because the implications long-term for a child living in poverty are obvious in terms of having a great disadvantage, the impact of living in poor housing, having poor nutrition, often having poor educational opportunities. All of that reverberates into a less likely successful adulthood and bigger problems later on. So it makes sense for all of us to have a greater investment in our children. You mentioned the goal to reduce child poverty in half, within 10 years. There is a commission that is meeting as we speak to come up with actionable recommendations on how we can reverse that trend. It's expected by the end of 2024 we'll be seeing those recommendations. So I think we're all anxious, number one, that the commission's efforts stay on track timing-wise. I'm sure what will be recommended will have a price tag attached to it. And again, part of why we did the report that we put out there on child poverty is to say, with all the other big issues, and we often talk about them on your show, David, addressing child poverty needs to be at the top of the list as well.
Well, Tom DiNapoli, are you keeping track of the costs associated with migrants? I know the governor set aside $2.4 billion from the rainy day emergency fund, right? Something like that. And, there's all these costs, of course, associated with it. And we know the federal government is really responsible for the policy.
Yeah. much less from the reserves. Most of that was actually from general fund appropriation. I mean, the good news is, particularly because New York City is the place where most of these expenses are happening, those numbers have gone down a bit in terms of what the projected cost is. But the real point is exactly what you said. It really is the failure at the federal level. The federal government has not stepped up either to address the policy problem, but as important for us in the short term, to come up with the money to help localities like New York City and states like New York to deal with this from a cost perspective. So it certainly was not a budget item that we were talking about 2 years ago, but it is a reality right now that we have to deal with. I still hope at some point the federal government will step up. But in the meantime, New York State is attempting to support localities like New York City to deal with this.
Well, finally, Tom, I read on your website, again, it's the New York State Comptroller's website. You can Google that. Every day, New York State returns $1.5 million to those who file claims here. This is the unclaimed funds. It's kind of like a lottery in a way. You may have some unclaimed funds out there. I encourage you to reach out. You know, I got to tell you, I'm missing a $1.5 million check. I don't know where it went, Tom.
Well, we'll have to look. I don't think yours was one of the ones that I noticed at that level. But it's rare that the recovery is that high. But there's actually an estate account out there that I think is approaching like $9 million. Believe it or not, most of the recoveries are $50 to $100. And I do encourage people to go to our website. Just Google New York State Comptroller, but then click on unclaimed funds. There's a longer website for it: osc.ny.gov/unclaimed funds. We're returning, as you say, $1.5 million a day. And if there's a match, you'll get a check in a matter of a couple of days. So we always like to return people's lost money. Old bank accounts, checks that weren't cashed. But, we have approaching $19 billion worth of accounts of unclaimed funds. So a lot of money for us to return to New Yorkers.
He is New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli joining us on this week's Capital Connection. Tom, as always, we thank you, and we'll talk to you again soon.
You bet. Happy summer, David, to you and all your wonderful listeners.
And to you as well.
The Capital Connection is a production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. You can listen to The Capital Connection anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or anywhere you get your podcast. And join us again next week at this same time for another political conversation. For The Capital Connection, I'm David Gustina.
Support for The Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative.